Brahms is a controversial figure in music history. Egotistical, prickly, and rude to everyone, including his close friends. He was called backward-looking for his devotion to the forms of the previous generation, the classical period. In his 20s, he was hailed as the savior of music by Robert Schumann, a composer who would fight back against the new German school of composing, headed by Liszt and Wagner. It would take him another 20 years to claim that title through his major orchestral works. Brahms would obsessively hold back the works that he did not think met his compositional standard, burning sketches and early works. He also burned letters, actively trying to mold the idea of his legacy into something he found fit for history. Today we will be surveying Brahms' early life up to his relationship with Clara Schumann. Brahms was born in Hamburg in 1833 to Johann Jacob Brahms and Johanna Henrika Christiane Niesen. Brahms' father, Johann Jacob, was a gigging musician on the double bass and the horn. During Brahms' childhood, he would play for the local militia and become a double bass player in the Hamburg Philharmonic Society. As Johann Jacob prospered, the Brahms family moved from house to house, upgrading their accommodations. Johann Jacob was Brahms' first music teacher, determined to give his child the chance he felt he never had. Brahms' father had to fight with his family to become a musician. He trained Brahms in cello, horn, and violin. Brahms' wish was to play the piano, so Johann Jacob found him a teacher, Anno Kassel, in 1840. Brahms would study with him and practice at his house for most of his childhood. When Brahms was 10, Johann Jacob pulled together an official debut for Brahms, a concert in support of his continued studies. Brahms performed Beethoven's Quintet for Piano and Winds, Opus 16, and a piano quartet by Mozart. In the audience was an impresario that tried to dazzle the Brahms family into allowing him to take Brahms on a tour of America as a prodigy. His piano teacher, Otto Kassel, was so shocked and dismayed by this that he gave his most promising student over to his teacher, Edward Markson, one of the leading musicians in Hamburg, to try to dissuade the family from leaving. The plot worked, and Brahms did not depart for America. Markson had been a personal acquaintance of Beethoven and Schubert, admired the works of Mozart and Haydn, and was a devotee of the mostly forgotten music of J.S. Bach. It was Markson's grounding in the style and form of the previous generation of composers that would put an indelible mark on Brahms' compositional style for his entire life. By the time he was 18, with the first works he allowed to survive, Brahms possessed something that cannot be taught, a musical voice audibly grounded in tradition, and at the same time unlike any other ever heard. Brahms thought that Markson's education was incomplete. Early on, Brahms was always unsure of himself with orchestration. It would take him many years and the help of many friends before Brahms became a sure orchestrator. It was also around this time that Brahms was forced by his father to support the family with his newfound talent at the piano. Brahms started to play in the bars and brothels around the seaport of Hamburg in the red light district. This was to have a profound effect on Brahms throughout his life. Not only was he playing for sailors and their girls, but he was also thrust into the scene night after night. Later in life, Brahms would recall those nights as something dark and shameful. He began to despise the idea of women and began a misogyny that permeated the rest of his life. He would never be able to separate the idea of women and love from what he saw in the rough dives of St. Pauli's. He would put some women of talent on a pedestal, virginal and untouchable, but never marry. In 1850, Brahms met Hungarian violinist Edward Remenyi and accompanied him in a number of recitals over the next few years. They went on recital tours through Germanic lands, at this point not a true country, where Brahms accompanied Remenyi in performance. Remenyi introduced Brahms to the Hungarian style of music and started a love affair between Brahms and the Magyar and Hungarian folk music style. Through his association with Remenyi, Brahms met one of his closest friends and collaborators, for the rest of his life, virtuoso violinist Joseph Joachim. Brahms remembered Joachim playing the Beethoven Violin Concerto in Hamburg a few years earlier and was excited to meet him. During that first meeting, Brahms played some of his own solo piano pieces for Joachim, who remembered 50 years later, "Never in the course of my artist's life have I been more completely overwhelmed." Joachim had already been the concertmaster of Liszt's orchestra in Weimar and had a philosophical falling out with the new German school of Liszt. Due to his disillusionment with Liszt's music, the dislike of Liszt's circle of sycophants, and Liszt's grandstanding during performance, the grimacing, the fainting, the suffering Christ act. It would take Joachim a few more years to make his break with the new German school public. Joachim found a new vision for the future in the music of Brahms and began promoting him to his well-connected friends. One of Joachim's friends that he insisted that Brahms meet was Robert Schumann. Brahms was about to embark on a hiking tour of the Rhine. Hiking was one of Brahms' favorite leisure activities, and he would keep it up for his whole life. And Joachim mentioned that the Schumanns' residence in Düsseldorf was on the way. Brahms expressed doubt in meeting with the Schumanns because a few years before the composer had been in Hamburg and Brahms had sent him a package of his compositions, only for the package to be returned unopened. Joachim pressed and Brahms folded. He knocked on the Schumanns' door in Düsseldorf on September 30th, 1853. The Schumanns were out, so Brahms was told to come back the next day before noon. He did, and was ushered into the house and asked to play something. He played his piano sonatas and a number of other works for both Robert and Clara Schumann all afternoon. Once Brahms was done, Robert patted him on the shoulder and told him, "You and I understand each other." He was invited over to lunch the next day, then convinced to stay with the Schumanns for the next month until Joachim was scheduled to be in Düsseldorf. Thus, a long, fruitful friendship was forged with both Robert and Clara Schumann. Robert wasted little time advancing Brahms' interest to his circle. On October 28, 1853, Robert published an article about Brahms in the newer Zeitschrift for music called Neue Bahnen, or New Paths, nominating Brahms as the one who was fated to give expression to the times in the highest and most ideal manner, basically setting Brahms up in opposition to Liszt, Wagner, and the new German school. Brahms would spend the next 20 years wrestling with the notoriety that article hung around his neck like a millstone. Schumann also persuaded Breitkopf and Hartel to buy and publish some of Brahms' compositions. They published both his Opus 1, the Piano Sonata No. 1 in C major, and Opus 2, the Piano Sonata No. 2 in F-sharp minor, along with some other works. Also published was Brahms' Piano Sonata No. 3 in F minor, his last piano sonata. Brahms never returned to the form. Let's look at that piano sonata, one of the most successful piano sonatas in the century. Brahms comes close to the pianism of Liszt in this tempestuous work. There's a masterful combination of free romantic spirit and strict classical architecture, the calling cards of Brahms' future directions as a composer. The piano sonata is infused with the instantly recognizable motive from Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 during the first movement, third, and fourth movements. It was the last work he submitted to Robert for critique. Let's hear the opening of the work, contrasting a forceful and pianistic entrance that spans almost the entire range of the piano register with a dark and mystical section, only to go back to the forceful motive. beset by mental illness, in February of 1854, Robert Schumann tried to take his life by jumping off a bridge in Dusseldorf into the Rhine. After he was fished out by some boatmen, Robert was committed to an asylum near Bonn. Brahms was in Hanover with Joachim when word of Robert reached them. Brahms immediately set out for Dusseldorf, with Joachim following a few weeks behind. Clara reignited her solo career, starting to tour as a piano virtuoso to support her 7 children. During this time, Brahms mostly stayed in Dusseldorf, arranging Robert's papers and sorting his compositions, playing with the Schumann children and visiting Robert in Bonn. Clara was not allowed to visit Robert until 2 days before he died, so Brahms acted as an intermediary. Slowly, during this time, Brahms began to fall in love with Clara Schumann. A formidable musician, she seemed everything that Brahms could have wanted. Just as slowly, Clara fell in love with him. Even though she was still devoted to her husband Robert, she was coming to rely on Brahms more and more for emotional comfort during trying times. They wrote very expressive letters to one another, declaring their love for one another. Brahms wrote Clara in one letter, "I wish I could write to you as tenderly as I love you and tell you all the good things that I wish you. You are so infinitely dear to me, dearer than I can say. If this goes on much longer as they are at present, I shall have some time to put you under glass or to have you set in gold. If only I could live in the same town with you and my parents. Do write me a nice letter soon. Your letters are like kisses." Romantic letters were the vogue of the time, reflecting the Romantic period, but the ardor that flowed between Brahms and Clara was something else. Just in the middle of this crescendo of feeling, Robert died in the asylum in Bonn. Clara saw him and tended to him in his last days. 2 months later, Clara and Brahms decided to go on vacation in Switzerland. Since propriety said they could not go alone, they brought Clara's sons and Brahms' sickly sister, Elise. During the trip, Clara and Brahms' relationship came to a head. Brahms was not going to marry Clara. Jan Swafford, in his book Johannes Brahms, A Biography, addresses Brahms' reasons, saying that Brahms had decided that he did not know how to support Clara and her 7 children, as propriety said he must if they married. He had little idea of how he was going to support himself. He also thought that to write the music that he must, and he was driven to, he had to shut away life, denying himself a family and a woman that needed him. Clara's daughter, Eugene, was to write of the time, "He broke away ruthlessly. My mother suffered all the more as she could not understand the change in him." When the vacation ended, Brahms left Dusseldorf for his hometown of Hamburg, back to his family. He and Clara were to stay close confidants and collaborators for the rest of Clara's life. She never stopped championing Brahms' music, nor her husband's, in her concerts. After separating from Clara in Dusseldorf, Brahms returned to his family in Hamburg. He spent all of his creative energy on crafting the piano concerto in D minor. Started as a composition for 2 pianos, then expanded into a concerto after Brahms felt the music breaking the bounds of the 2-piano format. Started right after Robert leaped into the Rhine, it had reflections of the tumultuous feelings of the time, all expressed in D minor. Brahms sent sketches as he worked to both Joseph, Joachim, and Clara, almost in despair over the work but refusing to abandon it. After finishing a draft of the concerto in May 1857, he gained, with Clara's support, a position as a musician to the tiny court of Detmold in the capital of the Principality of Lippe, where he spent the winters of 1857 to 1860. He would play chamber music, solo with the orchestra in various concerti, and continue to write. He started a pattern of working summer vacations in the countryside, surrounded by friends. He would keep up the pattern of composing on summer vacation in the country, then returning to the city for winter for the rest of his life. The summer of 1858 saw him in Göttingen with Clara and her children by invitation of his friend Julius Otto Grimm, who directed music for the college in the town. Brahms met a professor's daughter, Agatha von Siebold, during that summer, and they began a flirty relationship. A lovely soprano, Brahms wrote a number of love songs for Agatha that summer, including several of the Opus 14 songs of romances and the Opus 19 solos. Agatha sang them for the company, with Brahms accompanying. In his infatuation, Brahms got careless. One evening, he and Agatha darted behind some bushes to embrace, and Clara saw them. Still in love with Brahms, distraught Clara immediately packed up her children and left for Dusseldorf, leaving Brahms in the company of his other friends. At the end of the summer, Brahms went back to the court of Detmold for a winter's work. He and Agatha were reduced to writing each other letters that expressed their love for each other. Brahms's piano concerto in D minor was slated for a premiere with Joachim's orchestra in Hanover, then a performance in Leipzig with the Gewandhaus Orchestra. On his way to Hanover, Brahms stopped in Göttingen to see Agatha. While there, Julius Grimm and his wife leaned on Brahms that there was some talk in the town, and if something didn't happen, Agatha would be compromised. Brahms took the hint and proposed to Agatha, and she accepted. They bought rings and promised to keep the engagement secret. The performance of Brahms' D Minor Piano Concerto in Hanover was polite but puzzled. The next day, Brahms traveled to Leipzig. The reception in Leipzig was totally different. Audiences at the time applauded at the end of movements, but there was absolutely no applause for the D Minor Concerto. After it was finished, there was silence in the hall, then hissing from the audience. The concerto was an unmitigated disaster, and the audience in Leipzig hated it. The Signale critic wrote, "This work cannot give pleasure. Save its serious intention, it has nothing to offer but waste, barren dreariness. For more than 3/4 of an hour, one must endure this rooting and rummaging, this dragging and drawing, this tearing and patching up of phrases and flourishes. Not only must one take in this fermenting mass, one must also swallow a dessert of the shrillest dissonances and most unpleasant sounds." After the debacle, Brahms wrote unruffled letters to Clara and Joachim, but also a devastating one to Agatha. The letter was burned, but it moved Agatha to return Brahms's ring and break off the engagement. Many years later, Brahms was reminiscing to a friend and said this about that time. "At the time I should have liked to marry, my music was either hissed in the concert hall or at least received with icy coldness. Now for myself, I could bear that quite well, because I knew its worth and that someday the tables would be turned. And when, after such failures, I entered my lonely room, I was not unhappy. On the contrary. But if, in such moments, I had to meet the anxious, questioning eyes of a wife with the words, 'another failure,' I could not have borne that. For a woman might love an artist ever so much, she still cannot have perfect certainty of victory which is in his heart. And if she had wanted to comfort me, a wife to pity her husband for lack of success, I can't stand to think what hell that would have been." Brahms once again chose lonely freedom over hearth and home. As he wrote Agatha, he could not wear fetters and compose the way that he thought he needed to, because it would not support a wife and family. His music was still too foreign to audiences to bring in the money that would allow that. From that time forward, Brahms called Agatha his last love. Let's listen to a bit of the orchestral opening of Brahms' D Minor Piano Concerto and see what was so disturbing to critics and audiences. The opening is darker and more savage than other leading concerti of the day, where an audience could have expected something in major with the orchestra supporting pianistic brilliance. In the Brahms, instead, we find an opening which is a shout of unrest and alarm, low D in the timpani and strings and snarling horns. The key area is unstable, the harmony is unanchored, with wild chromatic shiverings of trills in the melodic line. It is not a concerto of untroubled brilliance. From the beginning, its darkness is apparent. The composition of the opening dates back to a few days after Robert Schumann jumped off the bridge in Dusseldorf and can be seen as a musical picture of that time. Let's listen to the opening. Brahms returned to Hamburg and performed his D Minor Concerto with his hometown orchestra to great acclaim. He soon established a women's choir with some of the amateur musicians in Hamburg, the Hamburg Frauenchoir, which he was to write a number of works in the next 3 years. With all of his fame in his hometown, he wanted to be named the conductor of the Hamburg Philharmonic and campaigned to be named to the position. He felt that it was his key to building a happy life, where he could settle down, get married, and have a family. The position was ultimately given to baritone Julius Stockhausen, who had never held an orchestral position in his life. Brahms felt insulted to the highest degree and moved his home from his hometown of Hamburg to Vienna. Brahms was convinced that losing the position with Hamburg Philharmonic was consigning him to years of toil as an itinerant musician. As luck would have it, once he established a place in the Vienna musical scene, he never left it. The years of drama and turmoil were to smooth out into compositional summers away and winters of concertizing in Vienna and the larger Germanic lands. In 1863, he was appointed as conductor of the Vienna Sing Academy. He surprised his audiences by programming much work of the early German masters such as Heinrich Schütz and J.S. Bach, and other early composers such as Giovanni Gabrieli. More recent music was represented by the works of Beethoven and Felix Mendelssohn. Brahms also wrote works for the choir, including his motet, Opus 29. Finding, however, that the post encroached too much of his time he needed for composition, he left the choir in June of 1864. This would be a pattern for Brahms, getting conducting posts just to leave them because they impacted his compositional time. His longest held position was the Winters in Detmold, which he held for 3 years. In Vienna, Brahms' circle grew to include the notable critic and opponent of the New German School, Edward Hanslick, and the conductor Hermann Levy and the surgeon Theodor Billroth, who were to become amongst his greatest advocates. In February 1865, Brahms' mother died of a stroke, and he began to compose his largest choral work, a German Requiem, Opus 45. The gestation was patchwork, and he sent sketches to Clara for comment. 6 movements were completed by 1866, with the last movement, to become the 5th, a work for soprano and orchestra, tacked on after the official premiere in Bremen in 1868. A humanist rather than a Christian work, it does not talk about Jesus Christ, even though the second movement touches on the Lord's return. Karl Reitenthaler, the music director in Bremen for the premiere, wrote Brahms to see if he could add something about Jesus to match the spirit of Good Friday, the date of its premiere. Brahms, an agnostic, was not going to put up with that sort of thing and wrote back, "As far as the text is concerned, I confess that I would gladly omit even the word German and instead use the word human. Also with my best knowledge, and I will dispense with places like John 3:16. On the other hand, I have chosen one thing or another because I am a musician, because I needed it, and because with my venerable authors I can't delete or dispute anything. But I had better stop before I say too much." As a compromise, Amalie Joachim sang "I Know That My Redeemer Liveth" from Handel's Messiah to placate the pious during the Good Friday premiere. Let's listen to a segment of the 4th movement, "How Lovely Is Thy Dwelling Place." Based on Psalm 84, the movement is straightforward, like a folk song. The choir begins together, declaiming the psalm, and is supported by the orchestra. The choir then breaks apart in a canon of entrances, reminiscent of a fugue. The voices all join together again to declaim the end of the phrase. Here is the opening section to "How Lovely Is Thy Dwelling Place" from the German Requiem. The German Requiem was an unparalleled success and took the world by storm. Choral groups the world over either did the full orchestra version or the version for two pianos arranged by Brahms himself. The Requiem effectively marked Brahms' arrival on the world stage. It is still one of his most popular works. Right around the time of the success of the German Requiem, Brahms also found success with a number of other works, including his first set of Hungarian dances, the Liebeslieder waltzes Opus 52, and his collection of Lieder, Opus 43 and 46 through 49. Following such successes, he finally completed a number of works that he had been wrestling with over many years, such as the Cantata Rinaldo, his first two string quartets, Opus 51, numbers 1 and 2, and the third piano quartet. In late 1871, a job that had been stalking him for 2 years was about to wear him down. Music director of Vienna Gesellschaft der Musikerfreunde. It was too good of a job to pass up. A full professional orchestra and the finest chorus in the city at his disposal, and full board knowledge that Brahms would program Bach and the difficult old music that was not quite to the taste of the Viennese. This repertory ran from Bach to the 19th century composers who were not of the new German school. These included Beethoven, Franz Schubert, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Joachim, Ferdinand Hiller, Mack, Bruch, and himself. The organization saw the premiere of Brahms' orchestral variations on a theme by Haydn, the first set of orchestral variations ever written, and one of his most popular works. Brahms had worked on the orchestration with conductor Hermann Levy as one of his final scoring exercises before working on his First Symphony. The variations see Brahms full bloom as orchestrator. Brahms resigned as director of the Gesellschaft after his third season and was determined to finish his First Symphony that summer. It had begun as far back as 1860. The symphony had been brewing in various forms for 16 years, worked on in short spurts in the summers during Brahms' vacations. The finale was the hardest section for Brahms to complete. He did not start it until 1868, unsure of how to finish his symphony. Brahms was cautious and typically self-deprecating about the symphony during its creation, writing to his friends that it was long and difficult, not exactly charming, and significantly long and in C minor. The premiere of the work was on November 4th, 1876, in Karlsruhe under the baton of conductor Felix Otto Dessorf. The work was received in the fashion that it was composed, as a fitting answer to Beethoven's legacy, with a symphony of commensurate dignity and intellectual scope. Hans von Bülow quipped that it was Beethoven's 10th, and many saw that with this symphony, Brahms restored the genre to full vitality that Wagner, among others, had proclaimed dead. The First Symphony is one of the most innovative symphonies that the later 19th century produced. Brahms achieved the paradoxical resolution of conservative and progressive elements, classical style, and romantic fervor. Let's listen to the opening of the First Symphony. It begins with a searing, anguished adagio with relentless pounding of the timpani. The beat is obscured in the strings and the winds, creating tension with the pounding of the timpani. The introduction lays out the thematic material for the rest of the movement. The fan of chromatic lines, upwards in the cellos and violins, downwards in the winds and violas. Jan Swafford calls it one of the most spine-tingling beginnings of any symphony, plunging us into a world of dark, questioning, shifting, striving towards some undefiable goal. Let's listen to it now. With his monumental First Symphony birth, the world was Brahms' oyster. He began to get awards from all over Europe. Cambridge University offered to grant honorary degrees of Doctor of Music to both Brahms and Joachim, but only if they would attend the ceremony in person and compose new works as theses. Brahms did not want to cross the English Channel, so sent Joachim to England with the score of his First Symphony. Brahms never received the degree from Cambridge. The University of Breslau conferred an honorary degree on Brahms, for which he wrote his academic festival overture as thanks. The commendation of Brahms by Breslau as the leader in the art of serious music in Germany today led to a bilious comment from Wagner in his essay on poetry and composition. I know of some famous composers who in their concert masquerades donned the disguise of a street singer one day, the Hallelujah periwig of Handel the next, the dress of a Jewish Sidardist fiddler another time, and then again the guise of a highly respectable symphony dressed up as number 10, referring to von Bülow's quip about Brahms's First Symphony being Beethoven's 10th. Ludwig II of Bavaria awarded him the Maximilian Order of Science and Art, and the music-loving Duke George of Meiningen awarded him a Commander's Cross in the Order of the House of Meiningen. After the stress of the First Symphony, compositions flowed out of Brahms. That summer he composed his Second Symphony in 4 months, nothing compared to the years of struggle with his first. Also composed in rapid succession with a Violin Concerto Opus 77, dedicated to Joachim, who was consulted closely during its composition, and the Tragic Overture, one of the pair of the Academic Festival Overture. Brahms was now a powerful figure in music in Europe and especially in Vienna. He had been on the jury which awarded the Vienna State Prize to then little-known composer Anton Dvořák 3 times, first in February of 1875 and later in 1876 and 1877, and had successfully recommended Dvořák to his publisher Simrock. At this time, Brahms also chose to change his image. Having been always clean-shaven, in 1878 he surprised his friends by growing a beard, writing in September to the conductor Bernhard Schultz, "I am coming with a large beard. Prepare your wife for a most awful sight." He had been growing stouter in his later years, away from the blonde good looks of his 20s. He also began to pitch his naturally high voice down, almost growling while talking. He came to be the epitome of Herr Dr. Brahms, as he was seen in the famous photographs. In 1882, Brahms completed his Piano Concerto No. 2, Opus 83, dedicated to his teacher Markson. Brahms was invited by Hans von Bülow to undertake a premiere of the work with the Meiningen Court Orchestra. This was the beginning of his collaboration with Meiningen and with von Bülow. Formerly Wagner's favorite conductor and a fervent Wagnerite until Wagner stole his wife, von Bülow was looking for another musician to champion. Von Bülow was to rank Brahms as one of the 3 Bs. In a letter to his wife he wrote, "You know what I think of Brahms, after Bach and Beethoven the greatest, the most sublime of all composers." The following years saw the premieres of his Third Symphony, Opus 90, and his Fourth Symphony, Opus 98. Von Bülow's philosophy of precision and fidelity to the score was seen as cold and calculating by some, including Clara, but suited Brahms and his complex works well. For as long as von Bülow conducted the orchestra at Meiningen, he placed it at Brahms' disposal as a laboratory for new works. This fruitful collaboration lasted until Brahms slighted von Bülow. After the premiere of the Fourth Symphony in Meiningen, von Bülow took the work on tour. Brahms was bearishly insensitive and repeated a performance of the Fourth Symphony with the Frankfurt Symphony a few days before the Meiningen contingent came to town. When von Bülow learned of it, he was enraged and humiliated at what he thought was a calculated insult. He substituted Beethoven's Seventh Symphony for Brahms's Fourth Symphony on the program. The two had a severe falling out that was miraculously healed a year later, after Brahms left an unsigned note at von Bülow's hotel in Vienna, consisting of a few notes from Mozart's Magic Flute, referencing the text, "Dear one, shall I see thee no more?" This was just another of a long string of friends treated badly by Brahms. He was callous and did not care what happened or how his friends felt about his actions. Another lifelong collaboration that was put to the test when Joachim's marriage to singer Amalie Marie Schneesweiss was rocked by an unsubstantiated rumor of an affair between Amalie and the publisher Fritz Simrock. Brahms sided with Amelie, knowing Joachim's suspiciousness, and wrote her a letter basically repudiating Joachim and his claim. Amelie asked to use the letter as a character reference, and it was read in open court when Joachim's divorced 4 years later. Joachim remained a devotee of Brahms' music and continued to program and play around Europe, but their 3-decade-long friendship had come to an end. Brahms wrote his double concerto for cello, violin, and orchestra as an act of reconciliation with Joachim, and they premiered it together, Joachim playing the violin and Brahms conducting, in Cologne in 1887. After the successful premiere of his second-string quintet, Opus 111, in 1890, the 57-year-old Brahms came to think that he might retire from composition, telling a friend that he had achieved enough. Here I had before me a carefree old age and could enjoy it in peace. That was until a new instrument caught his ears and his heart. His admiration for Richard Mühlfeld, clarinetist with the Meiningen Orchestra, revived his interest in composition and led to him to write the Clarinet Trio Opus 114, Clarinet Quintet Opus 115, and the 2 Clarinet Sonatas Opus 120. He nicknamed Mühlfeld Fräulein Clarinet, my dear Nightingale, my prima donna, and sometimes Fräulein von Mühlfeld. He was inspired and entranced by the clarinet as he had been by beautiful young singers throughout his life. By the 1890s, Clara had been dwindling for some time. She had rheumatism which prevented her from playing, and her hearing was going bad, preventing her from enjoying music. She kept up a dialogue with Brahms via letters, even getting extremely mad at him for publishing the first version of Robert Schumann's D Minor Symphony along with the revised version on opposing pages. They argued about it for a year, and it finally trickled out after a few groveling letters from Brahms. It was the last in a long of fights stretching over 40 years of collaboration and devotion that they would have. Schumann suffered a stroke on the 26th of March, 1896, and died on the 20th of May at age 76. In the first week of May, after he was informed of Clara's stroke, Brahms drafted the 4 serious songs. The texts are scriptural meditations on death. He told his friend Hörberger that they have to do with Schumann. I didn't exactly compose them on the occasion of her death, but the whole time I've been thinking about death, on which I have very, very often had opportunity to reflect. Don't tell anybody that I wrote the songs on the occasion of her death. I also don't like to hear that I wrote the Requiem for my mother. In public, he dedicated them to artist Max Klinger, who had lost his father. Brahms and the artist had met when Klinger sent him 41 engravings, etchings, and lithographs called Brahms' Fantasy, all interpretations in the artist's most visionary mode of the impact Brahms had on him. Let's listen to the 3rd song of the 4 serious songs, O Tod, wie bitter bist du, O Death, how bitter you are. This song is about death happening to all, including Clara. It has some of Robert Schumann's musical theme for Clara in the accompaniment, along with the words, O death, how well you comfort the needy one, who is feeble and old, and mired in trouble, and has nothing better to hope or expect. O death, how well you comfort. Let's listen to that section now.
Noch zu erwarten.
Brahms could never bring himself to hear the four serious songs in public. The same summer as Clara's death, Brahms was diagnosed as having jaundice, and later in the year, his Viennese doctor diagnosed him as having cancer of the liver, from which his father Jacob had died. His last public appearance was on the 7th of March, 1897, when he saw Hans Richter conduct his Symphony No. 4. There was an ovation after each of the four movements. His condition gradually worsened, and he died on the 3rd of April, 1897 in Vienna, aged 63. Brahms is buried in the Vienna Central Cemetery in Vienna. The death of Brahms was a watershed moment in the history of Western music. It was not the end of Vienna's greatness, even though Brahms saw the decline of the Austrian Empire, but the end of a school that had begun there with Haydn and Mozart and run through Beethoven and Schubert and ended with Brahms. Put up by others as the anti-pope to the Wagner's New German School, with the creator as high priest of art instead of entertainer as with Brahms. He led his own life throughout. The modernism that followed the death of Brahms was influenced by Wagner through and through. Brahms lost the War of the Romantics. Jan Swafford said about Brahms, "He had perfected an art evolving, fresh, utterly distinctive, in many ways prophetic, yet grounded in a conservative set of principles and techniques that he called eternal." Malcolm MacDonald called Brahms Janus, the spirit of beginnings and endings, who looks both ways at once, to the past and to the future. Thank you for joining me in this series about the life of Brahms. I had a great time creating it for you, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you want to learn more about the life of Brahms, I suggest Johannes Brahms, a biography by Jan Swafford. I referenced it a lot in the making of this video, as you can see by all of my flags. You can also support the making of these videos on Patreon. I get no ad revenue due to the use of musical examples, so Patreon is a great way to show your support. The bibliography for this video can be found on my website, dominiqueroyam.com. Interested in seeing my process? I document it on social media, so follow me for more updates. Thanks again, and see you in my next video.